Hi there. Welcome to Cutting Through. It's Davina Stanley here, and I've got Paul Ichilcik with me, and I think we're going to have a fantastic conversation. I have been practicing saying his name, and I think I've almost got it right. His story is fabulous. And anyway, really look forward to this conversation. We've been talking about it for a while. Paul and I have a similar background. We both trained as communication specialists at McKinsey. And in the time that I was there, we were quite narrowly focused in the sorts of communication that we focused on. It was helping consultants communicate better with their written and PowerPoint communication and training and coaching in that space. Now, Paul has that background as well with the structured thinking toolkit, but since then, things have moved on a little, and he's got a much broader toolkit. So he looks at design thinking and other sorts of narrative strategies as well. So I'm delighted to bring Paul with you today. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Before I dive into today's episode, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to my weekly newsletter called The Clarity Compass. In that newsletter, I share ideas that will help you clarify and convey complex ideas to help you get better, faster decisions. And you can sign up really easily. Just go to claritycompass.news. Now let's get on with this episode. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Davina, great to be on with you. And you did pronounce that very well after a few attempts, let's say.
Yes. And as I said to Paul before, I was terribly embarrassed about that because my name is not easy. Davina's not easy, but if I add my full, birth name on Davina Rill Truella, that's also quite the mouthful. So I've really tried so hard with people's names, but it's a fascinating name. It came from Eastern Europe, you think?
That's right. I don't fully know the origin, but I've heard all sorts of theories, like the last three letters are a note to the Tsar in Russia, CIK, but I have to find the full story.
Yeah, no, interesting. It's fabulous. And just learning a little bit about family histories and so on is also really interesting. And you've had an interesting life. You grew up in South Africa, came to Australia, you're now in the US, but it sounds like you've lived in the UK and Ireland also. Tell us a little bit about your background and where you come from.
Yeah, certainly been wandering around a lot, but I think I came to the US 10 years ago now, more than 10 years ago, for 1 month to do a screenwriting program, and ended up loving Seattle and staying in the Pacific Northwest for 10 years. But I did study in the UK. So I did politics at Oxford for 2 years and worked in London for a while. And before that, Sydney is home, but still haven't lost a touch of the South African accent.
It took me a while to pick it as an Aussie. I knew you had an Australian background, but as soon as you said South African, I could hear that little twist in your
Yeah,
vowels. So yeah, wonderful, wonderful. So we share lots of the Australian and Seattle connection as well, which is kind of how we met. So that's fantastic. All right. So, why don't we dive into this topic? We have these different modes of communication: structured thinking, which is the classic consulting method that came out of McKinsey. Some people call it the pyramid principle when they're talking about communication. And that's something that you and I both dive deeply into. Me, I'm pretty solo on that. That's primarily what I do. And then there's design thinking, which I play with a little bit, you play with a lot. And then there's the narrative stuff as well around story arcs and journeys. And I think it can be quite hard for people to decide, well, what tool do I use where? And so today we thought we would unpack a case study and work through that journey and some of the decision points that we might have at different stages and say, okay, well, what tool might help us there? Could it be one particular one or could it be multiple? How do we think about that? So maybe, Paul, would you like to introduce the case study to us first of all, and then we can weave in the different tools as we go through a classic journey through such a case?
absolutely. And just before I dive into the case, I think you touched on something important there, the different ways of thinking about communication and narratives. Business is very rational and very structured in its thinking typically. the concept of emotion, for example, often in a formal consulting or business meeting is poo-pooed. People aren't particularly open to it, even though it governs a lot of the actions that we take as obviously underlying emotions. So the full range, and that's what we're going to discuss a lot today, is how do we go from that structured thinking all the way through to something that's moving people more to action. And often from a communications perspective and the work that I do, it's what is actually going to move people either to make a decision or to take action. And I think that's a good lens to look at the purpose of communications in a business context. The case itself, and it's an amalgam of different cases and things that we've worked on, but it's about a management consulting company has done an analysis, if you imagine, for 4 to 6 weeks. Everyone's been hammering away at the spreadsheets and doing market assessments, and they're working for a financial services client, a bank. And this is a big US bank, but their recommendation is this bank should move into the credit card market in the Caribbean, or Caribbean as Australians would say, right? So they're moving into the Caribbean, and that's the recommendation that this management consulting group has come up with. But there's a whole bunch of stakeholders that we want to move to action. And the rationale, if you just take the more structured thinking or the logical approach, there's a few different rationales for moving into this market. One might be it's an attractive market, and there's high margins and a good reason to go in, pure business reason. Another one might be that branding. A big US bank has a lot of credibility and trust moving into the Caribbean. So marketing advantage there. And perhaps the third one is they have a partnership with a local bank in the Caribbean. So they have a distribution network that makes the execution easy. So that's just a very simple reason to go in from a business perspective. Yep, we're going to make great margins, profitability. We're going to have good marketing advantage and credibility, trust, and we're going to have a distribution network. So pretty straightforward, but I think the reason we introduced this up front is it helps to anchor some of this thinking in reality and not just a conceptual conversation.
Yes, exactly. And I so wanted to dive in when you started talking about the differences between logic and emotion. And this has been part of our conversations too, hasn't it? About, oh, can you use structured thinking to drive for action? Is it only about logic? And I think we're in furious agreement around that yes is the answer to both, but how becomes the question. Do we have as our primary tool at a point in time something that is an arc drawing from beginning to end and building towards a climax and moving forward? Or do we weave those sorts of emotive elements into our tone and our language, and then maybe little case studies and analogies and similes and other techniques that we might use within a structure? But then also, do we think, well, if there are some patterns, and I play a lot with patterns, maybe one pattern might be more emotive than another, or drive more for action than another, that still fits within that toolkit.
Yeah, and those nuances I think are really important to bring up, because it's not a cookie cutter approach that you can apply. It's very dependent on, and we're going to get into this, but the audiences and the objectives. And the one thing I would say about emotion that's often misunderstood, we're not talking about necessarily Hollywood emotion of moving people to tears. We're talking about what is it that gets people out of a state of inertia. And there is both the logical, rational, structured, and then there is the personal interest or the incentive, which is more tied to their emotion, the role, their future career. Maybe it's something political. Who knows what it is? But it's like, yes, what are those different elements we're playing with?
Yes, absolutely. Agree with all of that. And one of the things that we talked about, and we'll weave into our case journey as well, is what is it that works when you're going up to get the decision? And what is it that works when you're going down to start implementing the decision? And that's where you can see some different things at play as well. Again, coming down to roles and incentives and the way people work, the way people are wired. Somebody said to me this week that if you think of the Myers-Briggs framework, which a lot of people might be familiar with, that there's one of the 4 dimensions is N or S, whether you are intuitive or sensing. And I think there's a disproportionate number of very senior execs who are Ns, who think conceptually, who don't need step by step, but rather can see a picture in their mind. And I think having a place in your mind to put an idea is also part of the journey here. Having it makes sense when you can click it into a natural spot, the framework, the way you're thinking about things. So all of that, I think, comes to play here, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and adapting depending on how they're thinking about it, which you just alluded to, is critical.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So, stage one, the beginning of any sort of project, whether this is done within the project team or if you're talking about in a client relationship, you'd be thinking probably inside the company. If you're thinking about a project that's being handled internally, then that's possibly part of your own world. But there comes a point where you realize there's a problem, or maybe an opportunity, could be either way, and you need to tell somebody about that. And so how do we go about that? You might go very straight, mightn't you, if you're going up and say, hey, we've spotted a problem here. What do you think? Is this sufficient for us to do something about? And what techniques would you go to for that?
Yeah, and I think often at this stage, the early stage, and we think always from a commerce perspective of the audiences, we're talking about, say it was this consulting firm, maybe their client is the chief strategy officer. So we've got to try and understand, okay, our initial point is exploration of the different options, or even the awareness, as you mentioned up front. Let's see if where their starting point is, and then we can start to tailor our communication. So where is the chief strategy officer at? And not only that, but where does he or she sit in relation to the exec team, the respect that he or she has, and where is the organization, where is the board at? So that's kind of the things you need to take into account at the beginning,
Mhm.
that will affect the communication we have with them.
Absolutely. So understanding your audience and your decision makers, who are they really? Who is
Yeah,
it within that little ecosystem that's actually going to make a decision? And what specific decision do you want them to make? I think is also very pivotal. Are you going to get them to agree that there's a problem? Okay, yes, go invest some resources. Let's think about that. And you could do that in, quite a structured way, couldn't you? You do your discussions to sort of understand where everyone's at. You could then put something forward to say, hey, we think we've got a problem. Here's why. It could be structured simply like that, couldn't it?
absolutely.
What else?
And
Would you use any other tools at that point, do you think?
yeah, I think with the chief strategy officer, and this again is stereotype, you need to adapt it to the individual, but they're often
Mm.
very data driven, very analytical. So having the argument for why I should move into the Caribbean market, because relative to other markets, it's the highest growth area. That sort of logical approach is going to be, and the execution and the advantages we spoke about, that's going to potentially work. But maybe you have a chief strategy officer who's actually interested in another market for a different reason that may not be logical. Maybe they know someone in the South American market, or they work for a South American firm, or they speak Spanish, or they don't know anything about the Caribbean, even though that's the best, objectively that might be the best. So
Yes.
then the logic alone might not work, and you'd have to come up with some other reasons.
And what sorts of things would you then be having a really structured argument? And for argument's sake, let's say what I call a make the case pattern, where you're saying, we think we should explore the Caribbean. Here's a number of reasons why that's the case. Strategically, it's smart. Financially, it's smart.
Mhm.
It's a very practical thing to do, and perhaps the risks are manageable. So you've got a frame then of your reasoning.
Yep.
How would you weave in some other aspects, or would you just take that as the case story that you want to share and tell it a totally different way?
Yeah, I think you hit on a good point there. It's important to have that structured thinking as your foundation, as your base, because if you don't have the structured thinking, whether it should be data driven, it should be logical. If you don't have that, then you don't have a solid base for where your communication is going to be adapted from. What's the anchor? What are you anchoring it to? So that is critical. But then you might do, at the margins, you might do inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning. Can we throw out these words?
We
What do you
can.
need to
I call
explain?
inductive grouping, and it's
Yeah,
probably a bridge too far to debate
yeah,
why.
yeah,
But I'm happy to have that with you offline later. We can
yeah,
nerd out on that. Either way, we've got two different ways, haven't we? We've got a list of points,
yeah,
or we've got deductive, where you've got a flow of ideas, building a case towards a recommendation and an action plan. So
yeah,
we've got two different ways of, in a structured view, telling that story from an
yeah.
architectural standpoint.
Exactly. So I think, depending on where that chief strategy officer is, you, I'm going to call it a she, so I don't have to keep validating,
Yes,
but
go on. Let's call her
she,
Mary. Let's call her
yeah,
Mary.
yeah, there,
Yeah.
let's have a look. So like, depending where Mary is at, you might choose one of those two options. And you also might spark her initial thinking with a little anecdote about the Caribbean, something that's going
Hmm.
on, but that would appeal to her,
Hmm.
or an opportunity. So yes, you're going to go with the very structured thinking up
Hmm.
front and all the data, but it's how do you couch that and how do you frame it up? You
Yes.
might, there's a whole range, a spectrum of things you could do. If she'd come from a marketing background, Mary, then maybe you'd go straight to the marketing piece and the
Correct.
opportunities.
Yes. Yes.
If was a former financial analyst, then maybe you've just come in to her with all of the
And the
spreadsheets
numbers.
and the
Mm.
numbers. So yeah, you've got to take the audience into account there.
You do, and you can make some assumptions, can't you, even if you don't know Mary very well, around her role, and just LinkedIn stalk her, actually.
Yep.
Obviously, you talk to people if you can, to understand a bit more about her personally, but those basics can help such a lot in understanding her background and so on. And I love the way you said there you could open with a little anecdote or something like that. And so far we've talked about the body of the story, haven't we? The main message being we should consider, we should invest some resources to explore. I think we're at that
Yep.
early stage of going to the Caribbean, and here's why, and we might build that case out one of two ways. But you lead with a little bit before that. The McKinsey language would be situation, complication, question, answer, that
Mhm.
really short introduction.
Yeah.
And you might have your anecdote in there, mightn't you, to sort of tease her with something exciting or appealing in that very beginning before you got to the main message. The
Yeah.
trick being, of course, to keep that really short.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you mentioned there like the McKinsey approach, the other piece, which I know you're deeply steeped in and very advanced in, is the pyramid logic and pyramid thinking, which for people who are not familiar with it is just a very structured way of thinking and keeping your argument clear for people to understand. I love the pyramid structure because it's like a navigation tool for a conversation, for a discussion, for any communication, whether structured or motive. The pyramid thinking with the governing thought, and then maybe your subpoints, which are all mutually exclusive and comprehensive, as we would say, MECE.
Yes.
Um, I think I think that's a great yeah, it's a navigation point where you can jump between things but still keep everything coherent. So that's where, even if it's the most creative, engaging presentation that you have to try to move people, you still need to be grounded in that structure.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I think that's something that gets a little lost too. Sometimes I hear people talking about the pyramid thinking as being the logic and
Mhm,
only the logic.
mhm.
And, the other methods being, oh, they're how you engage people. And
Yep,
I just think there's such wonderful ways to bring them together. So I love the way you're saying that one strategy is to have your pyramid thinking laid out. I like to do it on a really structured one page, have that laid out, and then you use that as your anchor to keep coming back. And there's so many different ways of using that. I
yep,
think, once you have that clear in your mind, you don't need to present it at all. It can just be, a food for a conversation, to fish for more information too, right?
exactly. And we've all sat in conversations which go off track, and we can't,
Hmm.
these strategic discussions, which just seem to be a gab fest and people putting their opinions. But I think that
Yeah.
pyramid structure is a great way to bring people back to, okay, what are we actually arguing and solving for here, rather than just everyone mouthing off.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I actually think it helps focus what you're calling the mouthing off too, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Because if the conversation is focused like that, then whatever stage of the journey you're at, you're saying, here's where we're focusing today. And, some people begin with really long story and background.
yeah,
And you use the story arcs at that early stage in a very lengthy way. And I think that can lose people. That's where you start to have all sorts of people contributing because the boundaries of the conversation aren't so clear. So that's where I think there can be a little bit of a danger with that as that way of telling stories. You know what I mean? If it's not
yeah,
very well managed, it can go a bit loose. So I think that,
absolutely.
there's risks with both methods, I think.
Especially if you don't have the floor, if you're not giving a presentation for 10 minutes, if it's a discussion, you got to be really quickly get to your whatever structure you use, get to the point quickly, otherwise you're going to lose your flow.
Absolutely. Yeah. For yourself as a presenter as well,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So if we're grounding off there, so step one might be alerting decision makers to a problem or an opportunity. And it could be to get a decision perhaps to invest some time or some priority in doing a bit more analysis. That could be where that's at that early stage. And you could use, I think we're suggesting you could use a really structured framework to anchor that conversation. You might introduce with a short narrative to excite somebody about some possibility that they might not have thought of before, or you might weave some of that in. But ultimately, you need that case as the anchor as to why you should invest time or money into exploring further. Yeah.
Yep, for sure. And then, as you were saying, to then start to convince other people, if you've got Mary on board, who are the other people that she immediately needs to influence and then longer term?
Yes, yes. So then you get to a place where you say, right, we've got commitment to do something exploratory, to learn some more. And so the next possible communication, and look, sometimes these get brought together in one big communication, but we're just breaking it out for the sake of the full journey. The next step would be to say, okay, we've agreed to put some resources on this. Now, what should those resources do in that exploratory phase? So, what sort of options might they consider? So, you might put forward a list of three, let's say the magic number three, it might not be three, but a small number of ways in which this time or this money could be spent
Hmm.
to explore. And, I've got my favorite pattern. It's a grouping or what you call inductive structure, which is, and I call it shortlist, where we say, let's say we've got three potential ways forward. And, there's this one, there's that one, and there's that one, three options. And I'm suggesting we explore all three. That's my proposition.
Hmm.
So that's a very structured way of telling that story. Is that how you would say is the cleanest, best way of doing it at that point? Or are there other techniques to use at that point also?
Yeah, so again, if you're dealing with, say, the extended executive team or the CEO, getting them on board, often that very structured approach is what people will default to, and because it works, and people are very much in that zone of thinking. But it's not the only thing that you can do, and this is where you start to bring in some design thinking concepts. And for me, design thinking is really just a way to practically apply your audience insights and get immediate feedback. So for people who are not familiar with design thinking, it's been around for a long time now, but started in the tech world. It's about understanding end user needs and then iterating on product development based on those user needs. But we apply it now in all sorts of fields and communications here. It is on one hand understanding what's on the CEO's mind, what's on the CMO, Chief Marketing Officer's mind, maybe the CFO as well. And so you do your analysis and understanding of those stakeholders, what they care about, what their priorities are. And again, maybe the CFO is only looking at the numbers and the CEO has something else on their mind, like making a bold statement because they need to advance their career. But design thinking is useful here because you can start to practice or iterate on different framings of the options or the solutions and testing those out. Maybe it's with Mary and her team. You just say, look, these are different ways we could present the three options, that these are the right three options. to be discussing based on our audience. Let's do a little bit of a step into their shoes and give us feedback on how they would respond. What would they? Because otherwise, what can happen is you do this beautiful presentation with one way of thinking, and actually the CEO is all about making a bold step, so they don't really care about the finances and as much. I mean, this is all
Oh, they all
scale.
care about all of it, but it's the emphasis, isn't it?
Yeah, and design thinking helps you to iterate and get to what will be the most impactful, moving people to action way of framing this.
Love that. So you're suggesting that, okay, we've got our one pager, let's call it, with those 3 options described as options. And then what you're doing is working with relevant people to say, how should we sell these options? What would be the most persuasive way from the perspective of each of those key stakeholders? And you consider that a design thinking sort of strategy.
Yeah, it's bringing in those principles because it's the same as when you give a speech. You can give a speech or you can rehearse the speech and get feedback from people. So when I coach speakers, the hardest thing to get them to do is to present to their colleagues before they give the big keynote.
Yes.
But when they do, the keynote is so much better because they're getting the feedback. So it's the same here. Let's ask one of, if Mary's got 3 or 4 people in her team, let's ask each one of them, one to put on the cap of the CEO, one the CMO, one the CFO. How did you absorb Mary's presentation or the positioning, framing, and they each give their feedback, and then you iterate it, and by the time you do 2 or 3 iterations, it's not very time consuming. It's also fun.
Yes.
By the time you go through that, you've actually fleshed out something that's going to appeal to to that group. And it's not just one person, it's a whole group. So sometimes you have to take elements.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that. And so just to picture this, what I do in my world without necessarily labeling it design thinking, and it might not purely be that, but we'll get the one pager together, ideally build it collaboratively, actually, with people who've got insight, or then maybe get people in a room or just send it as a draft and say, what do you think? How will this land with these people?
Yeah.
So it can be done, what they now call in the tech world, synchronously or asynchronously. Are you thinking about this always together? And are you also thinking about the person presenting and then reviewing? Or is this on paper? How are you doing that?
Yeah, it could be, it depends on the organization. It could be in a meeting, and then you've got to work out the situation, because maybe Mary is very close to the CEO, and the CEO, Rob is aligned with Mary's thinking, but the real stumbling block here is Jerry, the CFO.
Yes.
Rob, Jerry, Mary. We're getting all these very generic names.
Yeah, perfect. We'll find a Frank shortly.
Yeah, exactly. But if the issue is, okay, it's going to be really hard to convince the CFO, Jerry, but Rob, the CEO, is pretty much on board, well, then a lot of the design thinking approach or techniques is aimed at Jerry and what would resonate with Jerry, because we've got to get him across the line. Or maybe there's politics going on, but whatever it is, and that's also what I like about the design thinking, is it brings in elements of that are not just purely about the data or the rationale, but politics comes into it.
Totally.
Fear, all those emotions, human emotions, those dynamics are all in there, because when you're thinking from Jerry's perspective, you're not just thinking about his pure logic. And I think that's where it's valuable. And again, this is not, I'm sure people at Stanford, where design thinking is very popular, emerged from, they will say that's not pure design thinking, but I'm just bringing in these concepts and adapting them in a human context is really valuable.
Oh, I agree. No, I do too. And I think there's an extra piece there too around the Rob, Jerry, Mary, triangle, if you like, because maybe it is that you decide that the best person to persuade Jerry is actually Rob.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So the presenter is also key, right? And does it happen in the room or does it happen outside the room? Do you come in and present after Rob has spoken to Jerry and said, actually, I really think this is a good thing we should do, you know.
Yeah.
So all of this becomes part of what I call the communication strategy, and it forms up the messaging, doesn't it? So you're going from, technically we call summary, summarizing the situation, the facts or the information, to synthesis, which is all about the messaging. So, you're bringing design thinking strategies in to craft the messaging. And so we're in furious agreement yet again.
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
It's about what do we call
absolutely.
this though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And getting to those subtle dynamics, which are going to be different in every organization, but you still have your roadmap from the pyramid structure. And then I do think there's something about testing it out,
Oh,
because
yeah.
we're so unpredictable. Um,
Yes.
so so many times I've thought that the messaging is right because I understand an executive, and then I go test it out with their chief of staff, and the chief of staff catches something that I wasn't aware of, I didn't realize was so important to that executive, and
Yes.
it changes the whole messaging.
Doesn't it? Doesn't it?
Yeah.
And one of the things I talk about a lot with my clients is a framework. And it's a way of, let's go from the leader's perspective, but how do you work up a story and how do you collaborate to do that? Because so much of this is collaborative, and
Yeah.
that piece is often missed. And I've got a framework I call RISE, which is, ready the team so they know what to communicate about, which is bringing in their experience about what we should aim for, and the issues around the audience. I iterate around the one pager. S, settle the document. E, embed. And that's the piece that I think you're alluding to there in a way, because, at the end, once you've delivered your communication, the people in the room know so much more about their stakeholders,
Yeah.
from the process of pulling it together, but also actually from the actual conversation. And those gems get lost. They don't get fed back to the team.
Yeah.
So I think that's another piece to loop back around, you
Mhm.
know, because it's very easy to forget that the people preparing the presentation, if you're talking internally,
Yeah.
not necessarily with a consulting firm, within a consulting firm where your outsiders, I
Yeah.
think there can be a lot of assumptions when you're inside, because you think,
Yes.
oh yeah, we've presented to this group a lot, we know them pretty well,
Mhm.
but you're not in the room. You don't keep up with the latest evolutions in their
Yeah.
thinking. So that's
100%.
an important piece. Yeah.
Yeah, that is really, really critical, and keeping that alignment, which is often hurting cats, um, is difficult, and also teasing out any good story or communication teases out the risks and the downsides and the sacrifices, which we'll get to a bit more later. But even
Mm-mm.
at this executive team level, there's a tendency to paper over and say, we've got a solution now, the groupthink happens, or the power dynamics take over, and the
Yes.
CEO's, maybe Rob's a dominant figure, and
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
he takes over, and just pushes it through, which causes problems later, or the alignment's not there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that alignment piece becomes, it's essential going up to get the decision, but it becomes even more essential, I think, when you're actually ex executing, because,
Yeah.
one of the questions I get my people to ask and think about is, okay, so who's the most important person here in terms of getting the decision, but
Hmm.
also potentially derailing it later,
Yeah.
right? You've got to think
Exactly.
about both of those things, right? And, it's very easy to say, yeah, sure, 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 but we'll get around that later, you know. And
I'm
that
just
can be
thinking back
done
to a
too.
workshop I did many years ago for a research mining company, and the COO, uh, in the group meeting, didn't voice his concerns, but then privately it exploded after there seemed to be agreement, and our 3-day session was completely derailed because we didn't address that.
Right. Yes. Yes. And it's just so painful, isn't it?
Yes.
Just so painful.
I still have PTSD on that one.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's horrible. It's horrible. No, I'm with you. I'm with you. So, all right. So we've given lots of color there, haven't we, around the sorts of issues to consider really at any point in the journey. And part of this discussion is being mindful of where you are in that journey as well, and what tools you can use. So we've talked first of all about, okay, getting alignment around there being a problem or an opportunity to consider. Now we've talked a little bit about, okay, what do we say about getting that priority, and really which things to spend that investment on, the time or the money. Do we make it a priority from a time? There's two currencies, aren't there? Time or money. So which one of those are we going to use? And, we've got commitment that, yes, we're going to explore these options. That's sort of the second step. Then the next step is to say, okay, which one of these options, or maybe an extra one that's emerged during the analysis, is the way to go. So we're getting that sort of decision. And, there's, I think from a structured thinking perspective, there are lots and lots of different structures. You can use almost any deductive structure where you're building the case and then laying out your plan, or you can use what I call make the case, which is a grouping structure. You call it inductive, right? Where you've got your main idea. We should do, option B is best.
Yeah.
And here's why. Here's a list of reasons why. So talk us through that. Are there design thinking or narrative strategies that you can use at that point? Or is it good just to go in clean and tell the story in a really structured, a structured way with the right tone and the right messaging?
Yeah, I think again, the design thinking is useful in the understanding the audience. If you're presenting to the board now to get board approval, and this actually happened in one of, and I'll apply it to this case. But say the chairman of the board had a bad experience in their prior role going into the Caribbean, and they emotionally have a resistance to it. So you can go in and present this wonderful deductive presentation with all the data and everything there, and the chairman's, I'm imagining them sitting with their arms folded and saying, I'm not going to the Caribbean again.
I don't care how good an idea it is, I'm just not doing it.
Yeah. So then the in the design thinking exploration of how we're going to present this to the board, what would come up is this very issue that the chairman was burned before. So let's try and find what is it that's going to get them to move to action or to a decision. And it might be that competitors are potentially going to move in, and the board's going to look like they were sleeping because competitors moved into the Caribbean. And why not, take this advantage and not be seen as laggards or not being particularly creative. So if that's what's going to move them, or at least engage them, then that's the angle that you take. What's the competitive threat here and first mover advantage? Because then that trumps their fear of potentially, at least you're having a discussion now about their fear of moving into the Caribbean, or I like to use the word anti-story, but their negative narrative about the Caribbean.
Yes.
So yeah, I think that's important, because you're dealing then very much with emotion plus the structured thinking coming together in terms of how you present it. And all of that said, I do think structured thinking at the board level, at the executive team level, is kind of the strongest and the most commonly used way to progress ideas, because a lot of those people are structured thinkers. Doesn't mean emotion's not important. I'm a big champion of it.
Not at all. Not at all.
I don't want to overplay that you can just come up with an emotional answer.
Yes, sure. No, I hear you. But it comes down to the messaging within the structure, I think. I think that's where we're coming to here. And I think there's an extra piece there. I really like what you're saying about the competitive piece. I hadn't thought about that. I'll bring that into my own coaching now too. Thank you for that very excellent idea. I think there might be another piece too, which is understanding what it was that went wrong in that case for, the chairman in his previous circumstance. Why did it blow up in the Caribbean? Because that way that can inform the way you tell the story too. So, you might, for example, begin with something about how the Caribbean has changed. And that might be, I have a deductive structure that I call golden. And just thinking on the fly, maybe the golden opportunity here is something about capturing the way in which the Caribbean has, leapfrogged in the last 20 years in its, I don't want to pick a topic or an issue, but, in its particular aspect, which was something that brought the previous effort undone. And so, that can be part of bringing the right evidence to be convincing as to why the Caribbean is now such a wonderful place to go for this company, whereas maybe it looked that way superficially in the past. It now really, truly, at its core, is a wonderful place to go. So I think if you were presenting the case, you would want to believe that too.
Yeah, I think that's
Right?
such a good example you've just outlined there, Davina, is using the structured thinking to address the emotional anti-story or concern, but doing it in that, getting to the heart of the matter from that structured thinking. Or it might be what I've seen in the past, government regulators, for example, they didn't
Yeah.
trust. So then what's changed about that situation? Maybe it's this subsidiary that we spoke about actually is tightly woven in with the government or with the regulators in a, and they know who the key players are. So you're not going to be caught out. You're going to have local eyes and ears on the ground, and then the chairman can relax.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
you'd want to deal with that really early in the story. You have your short introduction, your main message, and the chairman's starting to lock down, but you'd have to include some essence of that reason why it's now a good idea in that main message. Otherwise, you would lose them. And then the very first section has to cover off on, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That issue, and just bring it home that we don't need to worry about that now.
Yeah.
And subliminally saying you're going to look like a real hero, not just because you're going to be a winner against your competitors, but you're also going to show that you've got this real growth mindset. You've overcome that very valid concern that you've had.
Yeah, exactly.
So that can be quite indirect, that little piece, but it's important, right?
Yeah. And those Andy stories, just to give a little side piece. I once worked for the CEO of an insurance company in Asia, and we prepared her internal strategy launch. The night before she was going to present, the regulators said that there was likely to need to be consolidation, and all of her employees that she was presenting to the next day translated that to mean job cuts and mergers. So she completely switched, to her credit, she switched her presentation. The first 20 minutes became about addressing that concern and that anti-story. And then she got into the strategy. If she came in and spoke about the strategy straight away, no one would be listening. There'd been rumor mills
It's just
overnight.
like,
She addressed it
McKinsey's
head on.
here, we're done.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Consultants get a bad rap, but yes.
That's right. That's right. And that's possibly the anti-story that a lot of consultants need to handle the minute they walk in the door too, right?
For sure.
Because you're not always there for job cuts. There are actually other good things that you do.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh no, that's right. It's all part of the battle scars of consulting, isn't it? No, absolutely. No, wonderful. All right. So just to bring us back to our own anchor, we've, got to a place where we've said, okay, option B is best. And there are a number of ways to share that, dealing with the audience's issues, comparing the options, whether that options analysis is very high level in the story or whether it's a little bit further down within the structure. It's all there. So we've got to a place where they've said, brilliant, let's go with option B.
Yeah.
And then either within that meeting, you will have shared the plan, and it could have been wrapped into one. I think very often it is. Sometimes it's separate because it's such a big deal to agree that this is the right option that they might then say, right, go away. It takes such a lot of effort to build the plan. I think that sometimes that's a discrete task for the more enormous sorts of pieces of work. So we're going to imagine for a moment we're now at the place where, the chair has got over his fear of the Caribbean, and we're saying, okay, let's put a plan together for going to the Caribbean. So it would be a structured plan to say, here's why this is the right way to go, right? Here's why each element of the plan is correct. That'd be a grouping structure to say, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, something like that. What other techniques can we use at that point?
I think at that point, because you're getting into like how it's going to be rolled out, looking at all of those things that people are concerned about that could go wrong, the fears and the behavior. High level, what is the from to shift? You're starting to think
Hmm.
about that for the
Hmm.
organization, because people are going to have to execute this at the end of the day. So getting alignment at this stage with the leadership team that's going to be rolling it out on what are those big high level from to shifts, I think is really important, which we'll then speak about later, how you communicate that. Um, and even a theme, an overall theme of what this is about, you can start to bring it in, because from experience, you want to have ownership really seeping in the leadership team at this point, and not just, oh, this was a great idea, but now I'm going back to doing what I do because I'm
Yeah.
responsible for it. But actually, no, it's the leaders that are now taking ownership. And so
Yes.
what's gonna get them to adopt it and put them in? There's a lot of leaders who aim for risk avoidance, but if you can use the story for them to take a stand and everyone to align on it and agree, and then the ownership, they're sticking their neck out, and I think that's what you want at some level, rather than, oh, this was Rob's big idea, I'm just going to focus on my thing.
Yes, exactly. And even possibly even worse, this was Mary's idea. I'm just
Oh,
going to
Mary's
focus
idea.
on my thing,
Yeah,
right? This is a strategy thing.
yeah,
Yep, sounds awesome. Okay, can I get back to my job in finance now? Bye.
yeah,
Rather
exactly.
than, oh, when other things come to me now in finance, I've got to really weigh in Mary's new thing that Rob
Mhm.
is now championing,
Yeah,
and I need to weigh other decisions and make trade-offs based on, financial trade-offs based on this new thing that we're going to do, this move to the Caribbean, and the marketing team and the operations teams and all of them need to be stepping up and making those trade-offs with that new piece of strategy in mind,
yeah,
don't they?
yeah.
And so, in my world, I think about, is someone going to be an advocate or they're going to be a champion?
Mhm.
And an advocate is somebody who says, yeah, good idea, off you go then. Sure, I'll stick my
Yeah,
hand up in a meeting.
yeah,
Absolutely. That's a low risk thing to do. And it's a good idea. It's not really my area, but
yeah,
it's fine. Off you go. Whereas
yeah.
a champion is in there with you on,
Hmm.
in the challenge with you, saying,
Yeah,
what do you need? How can I help?
yeah,
And how do I prioritize? How do I trade off? Bearing in mind this thing. So
yeah.
you want
That's really important.
absolute champions. You want to shift them from great idea to, okay, how can I help?
Yeah, and innovating and finding out those pieces. And a lot of time, to get to that level of being a champion, you do have to address their concerns and their fears, which is why I mentioned that earlier, because if you can keep those fears and concerns quiet, they're, they're not going to put themselves on the line. But if you can address them and say, we're going to resource them, we're going to give you this support, we know that this is a challenge to move from this situation to this situation, then they can say, okay, this isn't just talk, they're actually going to back me up. I will therefore engage, I will get my resources, my team to engage as well.
What are some of the best strategies you've seen in a meeting beyond just, yep, hand up, I vote, yes? What are some best the strategies you've seen that really work to drill in and get that commitment, other than what you've beautifully described there about covering off on and showing you've really done your homework?
Yeah, I think one of the things is to get a very specific scenario, future state scenario, what it'll be like in the future, and then ask everyone to identify how they would contribute or think about it, and you see how engaged they then are with the actual idea. Would they start to think from the CFO, will they start to think how they can advance Mary's idea, but with a specific situation of going into Trinidad, and this is how much the market is, this is the time frame. How would you, as the CFO, approach this? What are the factors? And as you get them to start talk about a real life situation, an example, it gets
Right.
them thinking rather than this abstract, oh, yes, we're going into the
Yes.
market.
I love that. So would you, for example, just to make this really concrete for people, would you go to this, for Jerry, the finance person, for a minute, would you say something like, okay, Jerry, this is going to require 15% of our budget next year.
Yeah.
What are the trade-offs you're going to
Mhm.
make that happen? You know, okay, Fred, here we go. We've always got to have a Fred from operations. This is going to be a significant effort in phase 2 once we've got the regulatory stuff all locked away. So we're going to have to start getting branches or, other things, physical locations set up, whatever we have to do. How are you going to prioritize that? How will that affect your other priorities? And you can just imagine, at least I can imagine in those conversations, which would be maybe private first, I don't know, then maybe public. I can imagine private first, then public. If you did them in a room together, oh my word, you'd have a really fun discussion. Hang on, Fred, you're not deprioritizing my growth plans in my market. No.
Yes, you got
Right?
you've got to get to those difficult conversations. Otherwise, you can just paper over and, like you said, put your hand up. And a big part of that is Mary getting Rob's full-throated endorsement that he's behind this, and he says to Jerry and Fred and everyone else, this is the path we're going. I'm going to constantly have KPIs checking on it. If things get escalated, we're going to be. And so, and if Rob's not prepared to drive it, then it's going to go nowhere.
Yeah, agree. Yes, absolutely. And that's the joy of being the CEO, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's your job, which is why it's so hard and so lonely, frankly, right?
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. So I think we can picture those sorts of conversations. And again, we're saying, I think, anchor around our messaging and understand our audience deeply. And then we're talking about a series of potentially smaller conversations where we're really clear about, if we can imagine having those finance and operations and other conversations offline first to say, right, what would this look like for you in terms of the trade-offs you're making? You've got a very similar, maybe, objective for each of those conversations, but it's different to the objective for the overall decision in the room, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you're wanting them to really dive in rather than get that commitment. So whether the general commitment happens first, then the trade-offs are made, then there's a bigger conversation in the room saying, okay, I've thought about my own trade-offs. This is how I'm going to think about it. Do you agree? There's all sorts of ways of handling that, but that's quite a big piece of work, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, you've outlined there the complexity of it all. And too often communications is kind of condensed into writing a good message but there's so many different one-on-one group, different formats and channels. It's very complex, and we're dealing with humans, and at the moment we're still dealing with humans until AI takes over. So we've got to factor that all in.
But isn't this the joy of it? I mean, AI is so wonderful. For example, to think about, what might be the questions to ask a CFO in relation to this type of proposition? What issues might they have? Just to stimulate our human brains. I think I'm choosing to be an optimist with AI at this point. I think there are some very troubling things about it, but I also think, what I'm using it for is to generate my own creativity and problem-solving ability. And I'm finding it to be fabulous for that. It doesn't do things for me so much other than, fix your grammar and all that stuff, which I'm thrilled to have something else do that for me.
Yeah.
Although I'm very careful because I actually don't find it writes better than I do often, right? But it will find errors, right?
Right.
Yeah. It will often lift the reading age rather than lower it, unless I give it that explicit instruction. So, that's one thing to be wary of. But to ask it for, how do I think about this? What do I ask? What would the differences between an operations and a, finance person be? Those questions are a bit general, I think. So maybe that's for a more junior person to ask. But still, I think they can be really great for helping those of us who are a bit longer in the tooth pick up on the things we might have forgotten.
Yeah, and I'm with you on. I think it's a great opportunity and exciting. And yes, there's the bigger picture things like philosophical and ethical, which we're not going to get into here. But if you take just in communications, a lot of the prompts that govern how AI is used and built, it's all about communications and words and how
Yes.
you frame things. So I think it's a great opportunity for people who are communication practitioners to take a leading role and to improve the quality of the inputs, the personas that you build. A friend of mine
Mm.
built a discussion between Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates on how they would solve a problem. And he went so deep into their personalities and uploaded, input all of their previous public statements and written statements that he's got a really strong profile of Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. And so now, whenever something comes up, he says, debate it. And it's, besides being hilarious to watch what they all say in their language, it brings up all these different ways of thinking. And, you could
Yes.
apply that, um, building over time your audiences and what's their concern. It's like design thinking on, I don't know if this is the right analogy, but design thinking on steroids.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. That's really clever. My brain is going off in all
Yeah.
directions now about how I can use that kind of thing. I think both of my boys work in AI,
Hmm.
and one more on the data side and one on the solution structuring side.
Yeah.
And they describe it to me as though it's a friend, in
Hmm.
that it's, just like it's a guessing machine,
Yeah.
right? And so when you ask a question, it's guessing what the answer might be, just like a human. Because
Hmm.
I said to one of my boys, I said, oh, I thought that AI would be able to answer this fairly concrete question so much better. And he goes, yeah, just like a person. They're just guessing, right?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
thought that's actually a really helpful way of, understanding the limits
Absolutely.
of
Yeah.
it, the assistance, but also the limits. So we're getting a little bit off piste here, but still, fabulous stuff to discuss. So let's come back to our process now. So what we've done is we've gone the journey up to get the decision, really, haven't we? And talked about some of the complexities around that, how we can weave in the structured messaging and also design thinking and narratives, and how they can come together in all sorts of different communication events around that. So we've got to a place where we've got the plan.
Yeah.
Now we need to go down into the organization. So
Mhm.
let's say we're going to middle management and we're saying we're going to the Caribbean people. Here's what we're doing. Talk us through that.
So I think the starting point here again is to understand audiences, which every communications expert talks about, very few practice it. So
Yeah.
I would spend a lot of time understanding who are the different groups, that middle management, what do they care about? Do we define them based on um, their concerns? Are they supporters? Are they champions? Or are they resistors? There's different ways that you can categorize them. Spend a lot of time understanding who they are and what they care about. And then the biggest mistake that I see all the time as you go from the step we were just at of leadership committing to needing to get the next level engaged is that it stays in the realm of the business rationale for moving into the
Yeah.
Caribbean and the credit card
Yeah.
market. So we spoke earlier about those three reasons: attractive market, marketing advantage, operational advantage with a subsidiary. That's all well and good. And you can imagine Rob standing up at a leadership meeting and saying, these are the reasons, and everyone kind of nodding. But uh, then there's apathy. What's going to move people to action, to getting engaged with it? And the reality is it's what's in it for people. What are the how's this going to affect their role? How is this going to be an opportunity for them, a positive thing for their career? How is it going to change the way the team collaborates? And all of those different elements where you need to step into the mindset of middle management and then everyone else. Um, and so often, because leaders care about the business, the structure, those three things that I've spoke about there might be top of mind for Rob and for Jerry uh, and Mary. But then as you get to the next level, it's a very different priorities and fears as well that you're talking about. So there needs to be that translation element. And um, again, you can use design thinking, but this is where I think the narrative piece comes in really strongly, is you've got to start to build the top-down case and the top-down story for the organization that's going to frame this overall change. You might call it a case for change, whatever it is, it's the organizational change story. Um, you're taking people on a journey, an emotional journey, and what is the character arc for the organization and for them that you're taking them on. And that's where things like the burning platform or the opportunity come in. And then what are the big from to shifts? Where are we trying to get to? And it's not all rainbows and unicorns that we had this problem and now we're solving it. The really interesting part from a narrative perspective is to pull out all of those sacrifices. So you're honoring where we're at the past. There's a burning platform of why we need to leave that situation. This is where we're going to, but there's a whole bunch of concerns and fears and things that we need to address if we're going to get there. And that's where you anchor the story in those from to shifts, how we're going to get there.
Amazing. So I love the way you're talking about going from apathy to action. That's a beautiful way of thinking about that. And again, there's a theme that's continuing from the senior discussions too, isn't there? Of going from great idea to action.
Yeah.
And drilling in to make it really practical. So you're talking about these, the arc and the journey of a person and perhaps a character through that. Talk us through how that plays out, because we're coming to that third sort of method, I suppose, the narrative method here.
Yeah. So just as an example in this particular case, because I think it helps to be specific, is maybe the big change here, if you imagine the middle managers, is that this move into the Caribbean with credit cards is actually an opportunity for us to become really entrepreneurial and to be bold in the way that we approach new markets, whereas the US market's quite established. So therefore, anyone who gets involved in the Caribbean is going to have the chance to have a lot more autonomy, is going to be a lot more entrepreneurial. And you start to frame the Caribbean up as this is where our top leaders are going to go to advance their careers and to develop, because they get to have ownership and accountability very early on, whereas the US is a little bit more staid and established. Now that may or may not be right, but let's say that's what we land on. That it can be really powerful then for middle management to get excited about this and to see this as an opportunity, not just an executive rationale for going in to make margins of 3.5% and to execute.
Yes. Yeah. And that's stuff which is good, but actually what's in it for me?
Yeah.
So that entrepreneurial thread is really interesting. So you're talking there from a problem-solving standpoint of working out what is the hook, if you like, that would work for those middle managers. And your proposition is that this is going to be a great opportunity for being really entrepreneurial. And naturally, people will rise to the surface because of that messaging. So are you telling that story in a structured way? Here we go back to the basic conversation. Or are we telling that story to say, hey, really, here are 3 points why this is a great idea from it, with an entrepreneurial overlay?
Yeah. I think just in terms of getting to that entrepreneurial overlay, I was remiss in not saying to get there, we run design thinking workshops of all the different possibilities and we get
I assumed that.
But let's say we're there. I think you do need that overall structure because of what the journey's about. But then depending on your audience is, again, you might start with what is the future state going to be, for example.
Yes.
Or if you're speaking to the finance team, so is it Jerry's team? I'm trying to keep track now.
Yes.
Jerry's team, they may still be more grounded in the opportunity and the financial opportunity. They've been worried about growth. So then you're emphasizing the journey. It's still the same journey, but you're emphasizing the growth element, the story there. So you do need one overall story, but then each team should have their tailored version, and it's not up to communications or to Mary to define the next level down story. That's up to the leader who knows their team to pull out the elements from the overall organizational change story and say, this is what we're going to focus on. These are the threads that I'm really going to pull to, and the examples and the future state examples. So communications can't control everything.
No. No.
it can set the framework, but then it needs to be the individual leaders taking it to the next level and putting their own personal story in, by the way. So why does Jerry care about this? It's going to be powerful for him to get in front of his finance team and explain his
Yeah.
belief in it,
Yeah.
and then take that common thread. This is about being more entrepreneurial, but entrepreneurial in the context of the financial team.
Yeah. Yeah.
And HR is going to have a very
Absolutely.
different one. HR is
Yeah.
going to be about, we need to move people to more of this taking more risks, and they care about the behavior shifts. So the people team, it's still about entrepreneurialism, which is the overall theme, which does not change, but it's about how do we get people to move to behaviors that are taking more risks and performance management, perhaps, and their remuneration incentives and all of that.
Yeah. And so, the entrepreneurial, I think what you're suggesting is that the entrepreneurialism is the theme, but within that, there's so many different aspects of being an entrepreneur
Yeah,
that, around growth, around risk taking, around performance, around challenge, all of those things from a personal life perspective versus from a work perspective and personal growth
yeah,
perspective too.
yeah,
So, okay, though that's brilliant. And I think your point there too is really solid that the leaders need to make the story because there can be a bit of resentment actually when too much is imposed upon people. They lose their sense of agency. And if they can see a disconnect between what they know will work for their people versus
yeah,
what's being imposed on them, I think that's where you start to get resistance in those middle sort of levels. And I think there's a bit of a judgment call, isn't there? You sort of take it to the absurd extreme where you're saying, somebody on the shop floor, of course, they tailor something to their people because they know them one on one.
yeah,
Whereas when you've got middle leaders, senior and middle leaders, you've often got people who are leading teams of teams or teams of teams of teams. And
yeah,
so you don't actually know all of the people that report to you because there's
mhm,
just so many of them.
yeah,
And so when you're doing that, I think hitting on the right issue or the
mhm.
right messaging, the right theme can be all the more difficult, can't it?
Yeah, and that's where again, we used examples for the exec team, but you use examples at this level as well. Um, if we're going to be more entrepreneurial, what does that mean? Let's give a specific context.
Yeah.
Um, and so often you hear innovation and collaboration are the two ones that come up all the time. And it kind of drives me a bit crazy when leaders say it and then they expect everyone just to
Oh,
be innovative.
I know. And what does it mean?
Yeah, what does
Yeah.
it mean? But if you can take it in their specific context, people get excited. Then it becomes top down, yes, and bottom up. This is what we mean by the innovation, and you can feed
Hmm.
those back
Hmm.
to leadership. And so
Oh, yeah.
often, leadership realizes, wow, this knowledge within the organization has helped us to really fine tune and tweak what we mean by this strategy rollout.
And I think too that starts to respect and I'm generalizing hugely here, but that idea that the more senior, not only, but more likely to be this Myers-Briggs N, where you're thinking in concepts and pictures more, and further down, you've got people who are a bit more step by step and practical. So you've got to translate this concept into very practical,
Mhm.
relatable, I can touch it, see it, feel it
Yeah,
sorts of reality so that people go, oh, cool. That means this for me, I'd love that,
yeah,
and
yeah,
it doesn't matter where you are. But if it is just this concept, it gets very lost, doesn't
yeah.
it?
And that's where to do it in a practical way, you can build those personas out for different levels. And then every time you have a message, you run it through the persona. What would it mean for that person, for that type of role or region?
Right. Okay. So that's where you're bringing that sort of the notion of the persona in. You've got your characters or your personas, and what are the implications for them?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay. Beautiful. And get possibly, as we said before, that's the sort of place you can get baseline thinking from AI, can't you? But then you've got to make it very real to the
Yeah.
setting. So,
And we use AI for our messaging, tailoring messaging. So
mhm.
you can do hyper personalized messaging um, using AI if you have the inputs of what people care about. And so you get the leaders to build the profile of their people because they know them. Communications doesn't know them, but the
Yes.
leaders know people. Again, to your example of the shop floor, they could build a whole profile of. And then when a message comes from Rob, it automatically gets translated for that team.
Yes.
Now, I still wouldn't trust AI at this stage, but
No.
at least that leader can look at what the translation was and then
Gives
it
them
will
something
tweak.
to work from,
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah,
it?
yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah,
That's awesome. No, I love that. So we've talked now about this notion of bringing the story down into the organization through middle management and shop floor as well. I think we've merged those two. But then
yeah,
there's this piece around maintaining momentum, because these things can be quite exciting at the
yeah,
beginning, but then they can become a bit of a drudge, can't they? It's
yeah,
like, oh, well, now we've just got to make it happen. We've got to keep pushing when it's hard, and we're finding barriers. And oh no, we're going to scare the chairman again because we found a
yeah.
big problem. And oh no, he's going to cancel the project.
Yes.
What do we do? How do we maintain momentum?
So the first thing on that I would say is that the narrative is not static. So yes, this is the journey, um, and it is about entrepreneurialism. That's probably not going to change dramatically, but what will change is how it's rolled out. So you keep revisiting um, the overall story and then the team stories, which is what quarterly meetings are for. Um, and you might bring back that original group and workshop. How are we tweaking this? Oh, a competitor, has done a major move in the market. Maybe a competitor went into the Caribbean because we were worried about that. So then how does that change the
Reinforce
story?
that with the
Yeah.
chairman.
Or maybe there was a change of, the political situation in the Caribbean, and so you constantly need to be, as a leadership team and middle management, updating the story. But then also from the bottom up, where it gets really interesting, exciting, is where you collect those success stories or those journey stories, as one of my former McKinsey colleagues spoke about. What are the journey stories? And the journey story might be a challenge that didn't work, but we learned from it, or it might be a
Yes.
success story. And another group that
Yes.
I have worked with, which I'll give a shout out to, is called Anecdote in Australia, Anecdote International. They're masters at running these like focus groups or anecdote sessions to surface really juicy stories, anecdotes within the business, to show progress or to show challenges. And that's when it becomes meaningful to people at all levels. And so often this Rob would then take one of those anecdotes and then use it with the board and use it with their management, because that's what brings it to life. Again, it's
Yeah.
the human level.
Yeah. No, absolutely. No, I agree completely. And, going into those update meetings, thinking very clearly about what outcome you want and
Yeah,
what story to tell, not just, hey, we've done lots of stuff, but being
yeah,
very, very strategic about how you use those meetings at every level, up and down,
yeah,
right?
exactly. And the
Yeah.
personal storytelling as well, is powerful. Didn't really mention that, but you have at the top level the organization and the team story, then the next level team story. But then you're also asking individuals, how are they going to contribute? And that can evolve over time as they change their role, as their career
Mm.
progresses, as things happen. And an individual can share with their immediate team their story is very powerful. They might not share it all the way up, but at their level, to share it is,
Yeah.
people know what they care about, and it gives them a sense of ownership and contribution.
Yeah. Wonderful. Goodness. We've had a rollicking journey through the 7 steps that we came up with for the journey. Is there
Yeah.
anything we've missed that we've not talked about?
I'm trying to think what the one other element that I would just say is, whenever you're approaching this, if you can bring in that theme and bring it to life in a very practical way, then I've seen that being the most powerful. So you have the theme of entrepreneurialism, but that's just a definition up front. Now, how do we bring that to life? That's where your comms campaign, your success
Yeah.
stories can start to feed back up and really make that tangible. And that's when I see people repeating whatever the theme is. There might be a tagline that goes with it. That's when I've seen it really come to life. So a theme is not just a communications exercise that we put out there and it's messaging. A theme should be alive every day in the business, in the discussions. How are we going to be more entrepreneurial? What does it mean to be more entrepreneurial? What are the struggles we're having with being entrepreneurial? Oh, well, that raised, we need more resources. So narrative and storytelling, the change story, should be alive in the business. It shouldn't be a document that you get a big tick as a comms person and one great presentation at an all hands. It should be daily alive in the business.
Yes, that makes perfect sense. No, I think so. Very, very well said. No, thank you. Have loved our conversation and how
Yeah, it's
we've
been
woven those three things together, those three different techniques together, and hopefully made them really concrete and practical at the different stages. I've learned a ton from you, Paul. I've loved our conversation. So thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you for
likewise.
joining
It's
me.
been a really enjoyable. And one thing that you really opened up for me is the creativity involved in the structured thinking piece as well. There's so much juicy creativity. It's not just purely that rational
Here is
thinking.
the
And
answer.
yeah, and it's so important because at the end of the day, we're dealing with humans, as we said, who are so complex.
Yeah, yeah. Well, if you think where it's come from, it's from those early days of what is the answer to the problem we're solving. That's where it's come from. And I think it's just naturally evolved, since then. So wonderful.
Right.
All
So we're
right.
into the
Well,
Caribbean market and our business is thriving, the credit card business.
sounds wonderful. I think that'd be such a great place to have
Exactly. Go have a
a
toast on
business
the
and go
beach.
and be entrepreneurial on the beach somewhere in the Caribbean. How
Yeah.
brilliant. Well, thanks again. And look, anybody, if you want to learn more about this, we'll have a handout with some of the key things that we've talked about. You can find those at clarityfirstprogram.com/podcast. Find the episode and you'll be able to download the key framework that we used for the conversation. And we welcome you back to future episodes of the podcast as well. All right. Bye for now. So just before we close out, I'd like you to remind you that the Clarity Compass newsletter is there for you. It's free. I publish it almost every week and deliberately share really fresh ideas to help you clarify and convey complex ideas. All right, bye for now.